If John 15 were read with the reverence it demands, no one would emerge unscathed. Not because the text is obscure, but because it is too clear. There are words that don't ask for interpretation. They ask for surrender. I am the true vine. It's not a comfortable metaphor. It's a statement that excludes, separates, exposes. At that moment, Christ wasn't offering comfort. He was revealing an invisible axis around which all spiritual life revolves, or breaks. Charles Spurgeon used to treat this verse like someone setting fire to dry straw, with the awareness that something would be consumed. For him, John 15 doesn't begin with a promise, it begins with a diagnosis. There is true life, and there is the appearance of life, and the difference between the two is eternal. Most people read this text imagining green leaves, ripe grapes, a peaceful garden. Spurgeon saw a different scene: invisible roots, silent sap, precise cuts. He insisted that the most common spiritual tragedy is not open rebellion, but apparent permanence. The branch doesn't fall immediately. It remains attached. It occupies space. It receives light, but it never bears fruit. How can something be so close to the source and yet be empty? This question echoed in his sermons because it exposes a legitimate fear. Proximity is not unity. Religion is not life. Christian language is not transformation. Christ doesn't say, I am the vine. He says the true vine. Spurgeon saw in this a theological abyss. Everything that doesn't spring from this truth may grow, but it grows without purpose. It may flourish in human eyes, but it carries no spiritual weight. The true vine is not only origin, it is measure. It defines what lives and what merely imitates life. John 15, then, becomes an uncomfortable mirror. It doesn't ask if you believe. It asks if you are connected. It doesn't ask if you attend church. It asks if the sap flows. And this sap is not emotion nor religious zeal. It is the very life of Christ flowing through the interior of man. Spurgeon warned that many branches never realized they were dead because they were never pruned. They never faced resistance. They never lost anything. They were never confronted. They remained comfortable, intact, full of leaves and empty of fruit. And here arises the tension that few accept. The text doesn't only speak of branches that fall. It speaks of branches that remain lifeless. They are not immediately uprooted. They are observed. The farmer waits. Time reveals. The absence of fruit is not a detail. It is a delayed verdict. What is fruit, after all? Spurgeon rejected superficial answers. Fruit is not activity, nor visibility, nor recognition. Fruit is life reproducing life. It is character molded in secret. It is obedience when no one is watching. It is transformation that doesn't need to be announced. If there is no fruit, something has interrupted the sap, and if the sap has been interrupted, the connection was never real. This logic is harsh because it eliminates gray areas. There is no middle ground between life and death. There are living branches and branches sustained by the illusion of proximity. John 15, read in this way, ceases to be a devotional text and becomes an urgent call to spiritual discernment. Spurgeon spoke with the gravity of one who knew that the greatest deception lies not outside the church, but within it. How many branches learn to imitate the form of life without ever experiencing its essence? How many confuse abiding with resisting change? How many rely on the memory of a past encounter while the sap has not flowed for years? These questions are not rhetorical. They press upon the conscience because they cannot be answered with beautiful words. What is most unsettling is that Christ directs this discourse to disciples, not to strangers, not to opponents, to men who walked with him, heard his voice, touched his hands. Spurgeon saw in this a solemn warning. Exposure to the truth does not guarantee transformation. The heat of the sun can ripen the fruit or merely dry the branch. Everything depends on the invisible connection. John 15 reveals that faith is not proven by what is said, but by what flows from it. Where there is no flow, time takes care of revealing the emptiness. And this is where the first part ends, not with answers but with a heavy silence. If the vine is true and the farmer observes each branch, the question is not whether we are close, but whether we are alive. Because a branch can remain for a while. You can deceive yourself, you can deceive others, but you cannot deceive the sap. And when it stops flowing, the end has already begun, even if it is not yet visible. There is a silent moment in life when something begins to dry up inside before any external sign appears. Nothing collapses immediately. The routine continues. The right words continue to be spoken. The correct gestures are still made. But deep down, something has stopped flowing. Charles Spurgeon used to warn that the greatest spiritual danger is not the shock of blatant sin, but the comfort of accepted barrenness. It is at this point that John 15 becomes disturbing, because it reveals that the pruning is not an impulsive act, but a conscious decision of the gardener. The branch is not removed by mistake. It is observed. Time passes. The absence of fruit becomes evident. Everyone knows this experience on some level. A relationship that continues out of habit, but has lost its life. A job that still occupies hours of the day, but no longer carries purpose. Faith that maintains its form, but has lost its pulse. Outwardly, everything seems stable. Inwardly, the sap no longer flows. Spurgeon saw in this state the truest portrait of the branches that Christ describes. They did not fall. They did not rebel. They simply continued lifeless. And that is precisely what makes cutting them off as inevitable as it is frightening. Jesus states that the branch was in me. This phrase is disconcerting because it dismantles the false security of proximity. The branch was there, attached to the vine, visible in the field, identified as part of the whole. Yet, it bore no fruit. Spurgeon insisted that this is not a contradiction but a warning. There is a connection that is merely external, sustained by form, position, and coexistence. It deceives human eyes, but it does not deceive the farmer. The Father does not seek appearances. He seeks life in motion. Where there is no fruit, there is spiritual silence. And silence sooner or later is answered with cutting. The pruning, however, doesn't happen as many imagine. It's not accompanied by noise, nor always by scandal. Sometimes it begins as an almost imperceptible withdrawal, a door closing, an opportunity that doesn't return, a spiritual sensitivity lost. Spurgeon described this process as the beginning of a progressive judgment, in which God allows the branch to experience the consequences of its own barrenness. It is not God who withdraws first. It is the life that has ceased to circulate. The pruning merely reveals what was already decided within. This truth approaches everyday experience in an uncomfortable way. How often does someone realize too late that they lived for years sustained by memories of a vivid past? How often does faith rely on an old experience while the present is empty? The branch is still there, but everything that kept it alive no longer flows through it. Spurgeon warned that this state is more dangerous than visible decay because it numbs the conscience. The dry branch feels no pain. It simply becomes accustomed to the absence of life. There is a disturbing mystery in this process. The branch is not cut on the first day without fruit. The farmer waits. This waiting is not indifference. It is justice. Time reveals what words conceal. Meanwhile, the branch continues to receive sun, rain, space. Everything seems normal. And it is precisely there that the unexpected turn occurs. God's patience is not approval. Spurgeon repeated this firmly. Prolonged mercy does not cancel judgment. It makes it more conscious. When the cutting finally happens, it does not surprise heaven, only the branch. The impact of this truth is profound because it eliminates the idea of spiritual neutrality. There is no permanence without fruition. There is no connection without consequence. The branch is not cut for not making noise, but for not generating life. And this life is not measured by visible results, but by real transformation. Where there is no change, there is no fruit. Where there is no fruit, the connection is only apparent. The cutting, then, is not an arbitrary punishment, but the logical conclusion of an already established reality. Bringing this closer to home, the question ceases to be theological and becomes personal. What sustains your connection? Is it habit, position, memory, or present life? Spurgeon said that many only realize they were dry when they can no longer respond to God's touch. The branch is still there, but something essential has been lost. John 15 does not describe an impatient God, but a true God, and truth, when revealed, does not negotiate with illusions. This part ends with a feeling of deliberate unease. The harvest isn't immediate, but it's certain when there's no fruit. The farmer watches in silence. Time runs out, and while many confuse waiting with security, the absence of life continues to scream, where few dare to listen. Pruning rarely arrives unannounced. It enters as a discreet, almost polite interruption, and only later reveals its weight. Charles Spurgeon saw in this divine gesture one of the most misinterpreted operations of spiritual life. For many, pruning sounds like rejection. For him it was a sign of choice. God does not waste blades on dead branches. He cuts only where there is enough life to withstand the wound. Pruning is not the absence of love. It is love in its most concentrated form, because it removes precisely that which threatens to steal the branch's future. In human experience, this manifests itself in unexpected ways. A plan that doesn't come to fruition, a loss that seems unfair, God's silence when an answer was expected. Everything continues seemingly normally, but something has been taken away. Spurgeon said that pruning hurts because it touches areas we've learned to call ours, when in reality they never were. The branch feels the blade not because it's dying, but because it's alive. Where there is no life, there is no pain. Where there is spiritual pain, there is sap circulation. There's a detail that almost no one notices. Pruning doesn't remove what's bad, it removes what's excessive. Often God doesn't cut away visible sins but inflated virtues, activities that take up too much space, identities that have grown beyond obedience. The branch may be producing something, but not the best. Spurgeon saw in this a severe principle of the kingdom. God prefers less volume with more essence. Pruning doesn't come to reduce the branch to nothing, but to free it from what prevents it from fully bearing fruit. But how can we discern when the pain we feel is loving discipline and not abandonment? How can we differentiate the Father's blade from the violence of chance? Why would God choose to strike precisely those who seem to be bearing fruit? The answer doesn't come quickly, and that's part of the process. Pruning takes time to be understood. In the beginning, everything seems like a loss. The branch appears smaller, exposed, vulnerable. Spurgeon stated that it is at this stage that many retreat, interpreting the correction as rejection. However, pruning never happens to humiliate the branch, but to reposition it. By removing excess, God redirects the sap. What was once scattered now concentrates. The future fruit is born from this invisible redirection. There is also a specific silence that accompanies pruning. God doesn't explain each cut. He doesn't justify each loss. Spurgeon taught that faith matures when it learns to trust in the character of the gardener, not in the immediate understanding of the method. The pruned branch learns something the comfortable branch never learns: dependence. Without extra leaves, without apparent support, it begins to live only on what comes from the vine, and that changes everything. The paradox is that many only begin to truly bear fruit after being pruned back to their essentials. Before there was noise, movement, recognition. Afterward there is silence, roots, depth. Spurgeon saw in this a radical inversion of human logic. The kingdom grows inward before it grows outward. Pruning reveals who was relying on appearances and who was sustained by the sap. If pruning is a spiritual privilege, why is it so feared? What is it within us that resists losing what God has decided to remove? Do we love the visible fruit more, or the invisible source that produces it? Over time, something unexpected happens. The branch realizes it hasn't been weakened, but refined. What seemed like loss reveals itself as preparation. Spurgeon said that God prunes early the branches he intends to use deeply, not because they are wrong, but because they will be called upon to bear weight. The fruit that remains requires internal structure, and that structure only grows after the pruning. Pruning anticipates the future. It adjusts the branch today for what will come tomorrow. This perspective changes how pain is interpreted. Suffering ceases to be merely something to be endured and becomes something to be discerned. The branch begins to ask not only, "Why did this happen?" but "What is this being used for?" Spurgeon insisted that this shift in questioning marks the beginning of spiritual maturity. Pruning does not steal identity, it purifies it. It removes what confused the branch with its function. However, not everyone goes through the pruning process to the end. Some resist. Others try to artificially rebuild what God has removed. The result is stagnation. The blade has passed, but the lesson remains. Spurgeon warned that resisting pruning prolongs the pain and reduces the fruit. Submission accelerates the process. The branch that surrenders discovers that the hand that cuts is the same one that sustains. Are we willing to let God take away what we like in order to preserve what we need? Can we trust when the explanation doesn't come with the cutting? Or do we prefer to keep leaves that impress instead of fruits that remain? Pruning is not the end of the story. It is the silent preparation for something greater. This part ends at this delicate point, where the branch is still sensitive, the cut is still recent, and the fruit has not yet appeared. Nothing seems to have improved externally, but inside something has been aligned. The sap flows with more purpose, and what is not yet seen has already begun to be decided. To remain seems like a simple word until it is put to the test. Charles Spurgeon observed that almost everyone believes they will remain, until something demands real dependence. To remain is not to stand still, nor to resist time, nor to maintain a position. To remain is to continue living when everything that sustained the appearance ceases to exist. In practice, this dismantles the common idea of stable faith. There are people who spend decades in the same spiritual place without ever truly remaining. They merely occupy space. The vine sustains the branch, but the branch never learns to depend on the vine. And this difference only becomes apparent when the flow is interrupted. There are silent stories that illustrate this precisely. People who know every language of faith, but panic when they lose control. Others who have always been surrounded by support, until one day they are alone and discover that they don't know how to pray without an audience. Spurgeon said that true permanence only manifests itself when all crutches are removed. While there is external support, the branch confuses support with life. When the support disappears, real dependence is tested. Perseverance, then, ceases to be a beautiful concept and becomes an uncomfortable experience. A curious fact from agriculture helps to understand this. Branches that grow in excessively favorable environments develop broad, fragile leaves but produce less fruit. Branches exposed to harsher conditions, on the other hand, tend to concentrate energy and bear fruit better. Spurgeon used this logic to explain why many who live a comfortable faith never mature. The absence of tension does not generate depth. Permanence requires constant contact with the source, not with the environment. When everything is easy, the branch becomes distracted. When something gets tough, it learns where its life is. The unlikely thing is that many confuse permanence with fidelity to the past. They remain in memories, not in present life. They repeat formulas, relive old experiences, defend structures that no longer carry sap. Spurgeon warned that faith is not a museum. It is a living organism. What does not grow from the source begins to rot, even if it is intact on the outside. Remaining is a daily, almost invisible act that requires constant relinquishment of control. The branch that remains does not decide the pace, does not choose the path, does not define the outcome. It simply receives. There is also a disturbing phenomenon. Branches that appear extremely active may be profoundly disconnected. They produce movement, not fruit. They generate noise, not life. Spurgeon saw this as a common trap of religious activism. Doing a lot does not mean remaining. On the contrary, excessive activity can hide a lack of dependence. To remain is to know when to stop when the sap no longer flows. It is to recognize limits. It is to accept that without the vine, all effort is empty. This realization often comes abruptly, like an unexpected break that forces the branch to face its true condition. Unlikely stories emerge precisely at this point. People who, after losing everything that defined them, discover a faith they had never experienced. Others who, after being silenced, finally learn to listen. Spurgeon said that God often takes us to places where our abilities don't work, so that we learn to depend. To persevere is not to prove strength, it is to admit fragility. The branch doesn't sustain itself, it is sustained. This inversion is disconcerting, because it confronts the spiritual pride of those who believe that their perseverance is the result of personal discipline. The mystery of permanence lies in the fact that it cannot be feigned for long. The sap gives it away. Where there is no flow, there is stagnation. Where there is stagnation, time exposes it. Spurgeon affirmed that no one remains in Christ by chance. Remaining requires constant renunciation of the desire for autonomy. It is a repeated, daily, silent surrender. The branch that remains does not immediately stand out. It seems ordinary, but it carries something that differentiates it, a life that does not depend on circumstances. As this truth deepens, the narrative shifts in tone. Remaining ceases to be a burdensome requirement and becomes a liberation. The branch no longer needs to prove anything. It only needs to be connected. Everything that matters flows from there. The fruit will come in due time, not through effort, but as a consequence. Spurgeon saw in this understanding the deepest rest of the Christian faith, not the rest of inactivity, but the rest of complete dependence. This section concludes at this turning point, where the viewer is invited to reconsider everything they understand by permanence, not as a position, not as a habit, not as resistance, but as life received continuously. The branch that learns this does not fear tomorrow, because it knows that as long as the sap flows, nothing essential will be at risk. There comes a moment when everything that seemed solid is put to the test. It's not a public or spectacular moment. It happens in the invisible, where no appearance can withstand it. Charles Spurgeon said that the true value of the fruit is not revealed in growth, but in testing. Up to that point, many branches believe they are safe. They produced something. They were recognized. They seemed useful. But John 15 moves into deeper territory, where the question ceases to be, "Is there fruit?" and becomes, "What kind of fruit is this?" Not everything that grows remains. Not everything that impresses has weight before heaven. In everyday life, this happens all the time. There are works that seem great while circumstances are favorable. People who stand firm while they are seen, supported, and praised. But when the scenario changes, something crumbles. True fruit doesn't depend on climate or recognition. It carries within itself a silent resilience. Spurgeon stated that heaven doesn't measure results as men do. What seems invisible to us is precious to God. What seems small to us is eternal to Him. This inversion of values creates an inevitable tension, because it dismantles the logic of religious success. The biblical text states that each person's work will be tested by fire. This fire does not come to destroy what is true, but to reveal what is false. Here a disconcerting twist occurs. The fire creates nothing new. It only exposes what has always been there. What was appearance dissolves. What was essence remains. Spurgeon saw in this process the most honest moment of human existence. Everything done out of vanity, fear, or self-promotion loses consistency. Everything born from the sap of Christ endures, even if it has never been noticed. This idea profoundly challenges everyday experience, because we have all learned to measure value by visibility. The greater the external impact, the larger the fruit seems. But John 15 directs our gaze elsewhere. The fruit that the Father seeks often grows in silence. It manifests itself in character, in faithfulness, in choices made when no one is watching. Spurgeon said that there are fruits that will never be celebrated on earth, but that sustain invisible structures in the kingdom. This truth generates discomfort, because it takes away from human beings the control of validation. The narrative's rhythm intensifies when we realize that this invisible fruit provokes a reaction. The world doesn't hate leaves, it hates fruit. Leaves decorate, fruit confronts. Where there is true fruit, there is contrast. Where there is contrast, there is rejection. Spurgeon observed that many feel abandoned when, in fact, they are being identified. The fruit of the Spirit does not mix with the logic of the world. It exposes values, denounces emptiness, reveals inconsistencies. Therefore, branches that bear fruit begin to be pressured. Persecution is not an accident. It is a sign. This tension grows because not everyone is prepared to endure it. Some retreat. Others try to adapt the fruit to make it acceptable. Spurgeon warned that this is one of the most dangerous moments in the journey. When the branch exchanges faithfulness for approval, it begins to lose the essence of what it produced. The fruit remains visible for a time, but it no longer carries the same life. The fire has not yet arrived, but the weakening has already begun. The loss is not immediate, it is progressive. There is something deeply unsettling about this point in the story. The branch may continue to produce something, but not that which endures. The viewer is led to confront an inevitable question. What would happen if everything we do were evaluated not by its impact now, but by its resilience later? Spurgeon said that many lived confident years, only to discover in the end that their works did not survive the test, not because they were bad, but because they were never alive. Producing without the sap is possible for a time. Remaining without it is not. As this truth deepens, the narrative approaches its climax. The fire becomes a future certainty, not a distant threat. It will come for everyone. It makes no distinction between titles, positions, or past histories. It simply reveals, and this revelation will be non-negotiable. What is not born of the vine will not endure. What is born of it will not be consumed. Spurgeon saw in this final moment not only judgment but justice. Nothing true will be lost. Nothing false will be preserved. This section concludes with the weight of that expectation. The invisible fruit so ignored by men is precisely what will decide everything. The world may not recognize it, but heaven knows it by name. And while the fire has not yet fallen, the question remains suspended, laden with tension. When all is proven, what will truly remain standing? There comes a point when it is no longer possible to simply observe. Everything said so far converges on this silent moment, when each spectator finds themselves facing themselves. John 15 does not end with a poetic image, but with a definitive truth. Branches that do not remain wither are gathered and thrown into the fire. Charles Spurgeon treated this ending not as a theatrical threat, but as a spiritual mirror. It is not the fire that creates the tragedy. The tragedy was already formed long before, in the absence of life. The fire only reveals what was cultivated in secret. What is most disturbing is that these branches are not strangers to the vine. They were close. They heard the same words. They received the same rain. They participated in the same environment. The difference was not in access, but in response. Spurgeon insisted that many pretended to remain for so long that they ended up believing their own illusion. They remained active, visible, confident, until the day the sap no longer flowed, but no one noticed. Not even them. The end does not come as a surprise to God, but as a shock to the branch. This truth is not presented to generate paralyzing fear, but living discernment. Christ's call was never for appearances, but for reality. Abiding is not a distant mystical concept. It is a daily practice. It begins with honesty, with the courage to admit where life no longer flows, with a willingness to abandon empty religious habits and return to the source. Abiding is choosing to depend today, not just remembering yesterday. It is seeking the presence of Christ, not to feel something, but to be transformed. In practice, this translates into simple yet profound decisions. To be silent in order to listen, to pray without an audience, to obey when there is no immediate reward, to allow God to reveal dry areas without justifying them, to accept pruning without running away from it. Spurgeon said that true faith always bears fruit because it is born from union, not from effort. The branch doesn't need to invent fruit, it only needs to remain. When the sap flows, the fruit comes, not through anxiety but as a consequence. There is real hope in this closure. The text doesn't say that the dry branch cannot perceive its condition before the end. While there is time, there is a call. While there is awareness, there is a possibility of return. Christ doesn't speak of cutting off to drive away, but to awaken. He calls to life before judgment. The farmer observes, but also invites. The problem has never been God's severity, but humanity's refusal to remain. The invitation remains open, but not indefinitely. Time is not neutral. It reveals. This is the moment to decide what to do with everything that has been heard. It is not enough to agree. It is not enough to admire. John 15 demands a response. To remain is a continuous act of surrender. It is choosing true life every day. It is allowing the sap of Christ to flow within and transform what was once only form. The branch that chooses to remain does not fear the fire, because it knows that its life is not superficial. What is born of the vine will not be consumed. If this content challenged you, that's no coincidence. If it sparked questions, that's a sign of life. Don't ignore this moment. Reflect, pray, adjust, and if you wish, share in the comments what spoke most to your heart. You can even comment anonymously if you prefer. Your experience can awaken other branches that haven't yet realized that something has dried up inside. Like this video so that more people have access to this message. Subscribe to the channel to continue walking with us through content that challenges, awakens, and points to the truth. and stay. Not just watching, but living. Because in the end, it all comes down to this: stay or dry up.